Hey everyone, back at KubeCon, and what better way to start the show back in action? It seems like we're kind of in an in-between zone with COVID and everything else, but I love that the KubeCon organizers and the CNCF and the Linux Foundation said, let's just do this event. And I'm here with Chris Aniszczyk. He's CTO at CNCF / Linux Foundation. And Chris, I've known you for several years now, and I think back to those earliest KubeCons, and you were just saying, gosh, 6 years or so since the first KubeCon. And I was sitting here earlier writing notes. I'm like, I've been here before. This feels like it's just something of a new dimension though now.
Yeah, I mean, we're coming up on our 6-year anniversary coming up, and just kind of, seeing everyone here, getting back to conference collaboration. And, especially after the pandemic, a lot of us have kind of been, holed into our homes and working virtually as best we can. I think, a lot of us miss out on just being able to bump into people serendipitously, share ideas and so on. I think that's something that the Kubernetes and cloud native community has done extremely well. And we're very happy to kind of support people back in the flesh, here in Los Angeles this year.
All right, let's get to what's hot. So we were talking about a few different things. We're talking about the security software supply chain a little bit.
Yeah.
You were telling me that it's pretty popular topic.
Yep. Largest colo probably. I was, walking around all the different co-located events that we're doing, poked into like EBBF Day, Supply Chain Security Con. Supply Chain Security cons seem to be very busy compared to the other colos this year. Wonder why. There's been a lot in the news lately about security issues.
So let me just go through a few of them, and then we'll pick one to talk about. So there's the software security supply chain. There are the issues about, then there's eBPF, which is like taking, I think, a lot of things to whole new levels within Service Mesh, for instance. Then there's also, we talked about Rust for SCO, for example, and like how that's emerging, right? And so what would you pick as, something that really kind of reflects a bigger trend, and maybe in context with some of the sandbox projects out there?
Yeah, I mean, maybe we could tackle this in a couple ways. So, like, we've grown to over 120 projects now in CNCF. A lot of new sandbox projects coming in, and if you kind of look at the traditional, let's say it, profile of which language a project was written in, at least in the cloud native ecosystem, Golang obviously was a very heavy, favorite, right? Kubernetes was in Go, has a great community. I think Golang folks have done a great job in building a large community. What's been interesting to see is, a good chunk of our newer projects, especially in the sandbox in the cloud native space, are being written in Rustlang. Part of that is, I think Rust has matured a little bit as a language. The community is a little bit larger now than it was, 2-3 years ago. And, I think for certain types of use cases when it comes to efficient, memory management and all that, constrained environments, Rust may be a better position language than Go. But I think, something you'll see is there'll be a lot more variety in terms of languages used, I think, in the cloud native ecosystem. I don't think it's just going to be purely Golang, dominant, right? You're going to see anything that probably deals with like high performance networking, anything kind of lower on the stack will probably be written in Rust in the future. So I think you'll see a lot more, balance. We don't discriminate on any like programming language, choice. We have Java code in CNCF, we have C++ with Envoy. Like, people could use whatever they want, but I am seeing a trend of Rust becoming a lot more commonplace in projects. Part of that, I do think, is also related to, there's a lot of interest in WebAssembly, these days, and a lot of the kind of core WebAssembly community, there's a lot of Rust there, and so that I think just naturally brings it into to CNCF.
Maybe we could talk a little bit about WebAssembly, because we've seen a lot of interest in it at the new stack. What is it about the WebAssembly? I mean, it's been around for a while. Why is it emerging now, do you think?
So I think there's I think there's two things going on. Like, yeah, it's been an interesting kind of project, and technology
Yeah.
has existed for a while. If you know the whole story, it was basically built as kind of the sandbox technology for browsers, in
Right.
Mozilla days. So like you could safely open up a new tab, and that's all sandbox. You don't have to worry about things breaking or any security issues. It could all fail gracefully. Well, what people have realized is that core kind of technology, to run browser space environments could be used in new environments, potentially, right? That's this whole new kind of runtime could be used to run other types of workloads, potentially in other, languages. And if you kind of look at, WebAssembly, you kind of have this, bytecode, format that any language, could basically, compile down into and take advantage of. The interesting thing about that project is you know in order to be applicable to other environments, they needed to kind of make some changes, like by default, there was no like network socket support in base WASM, right? So there had to be a new kind of set of technology and specs called WASI to kind of support these use cases. So we're seeing people basically stretch the essentially runtime and form factor to support new types of use cases and so on. And I think you'll see that kind of continue because it is a very stripped down runtime that could support multiple languages, and it's very lightweight and it could run in very constrained environments, something that we haven't really had before, right? The JVM, the whole Java virtual machine Java ecosystem was kind of trying to do that, but it kind of built in a different epoch, different kind of use cases, a little bit more heavier weight. This is the first time we have something that's truly, lightweight, kind of very secure, by default, in my opinion.
Lightweight has always been a trend of this world, hasn't it? I mean, trying to make things more lightweight, where we have gone from more like these. I always thought of them as like heavy architectures, right? Where you would have monolithic architectures with the operating system on the machine itself, where and then the containers arrived and we
Yep.
had to kind of separate it from the operating system. How do you see this trend continuing? Do you see it
I
continue?
think just naturally, I think in technology, people always try to make things, faster, better, cheaper,
Yeah,
and there'll be new approaches. I think
yeah,
WebAssembly is just one example of that happening. The Rust programming language is kind of a better take on, system languages of the past. C, C++ are very kind of lightweight and efficient, but generally not as, maybe beginner, friendly, right? It may not support in different types of environments. So like I think it's just a natural evolution of like technology always gets pushed to environments to make it simpler, cheaper, faster, better, and we're just kind of seeing this happen within the
right.
cloud native.
Now,
uh
in our world, infrastructure as code emerged, right? Several years ago, we saw Chef and Puppet and SaltStack and companies like that
yep.
moving in, really kind of being dominant in that space. We had HashiCorp Terraform,
Mhm.
emerge. And, that is kind of then built into, I think what we do see now is like just the more program cloud, right? And you were talking earlier about
Yep.
the programmability of the cloud and how much it takes care of now, right?
Yep, absolutely.
We you, you were talking about a few of these tools. How do you see it reflected in the CNCF, like this programmatic capability? Just so much of the work is already done, so you don't have to worry about setting up the tools. I think eBPF might be an example of a little bit of that, of the tools that you can use to be able to help automate a lot of the work. For instance, in Service Mesh, if you don't necessarily need a sidecar, and you can just, have a kernel module.
Yeah,
So
I mean, eBPF is just something that has existed for a while, but finally, is like built into kernels that people are actually shipping, so they could actually take advantage of this technology. So the tools are building upon it. But I think back to your whole point of like, things as code. I think there's just been a general trend of shifting, you know, whether it's like configuration management, whether it's like security, configs and policies, whether things like developer environments, shifting it closer to where the actual developer is spending, their time, within their source control system, their environments. That's all getting moved closer to where developers are. And we're seeing this in, CNCF in terms of like projects like there's open policy agent. That's all like policy as code, right? You define your policy, manage it in your Git repo, and that gets kind of, you know, taken care of, deployed, and things get configured. The whole like GitOps thing, right? Let's go define the configuration of your application, and it gets all reconciled by some kind of GitOps service like a Flex or Argo. We're seeing this with even developer environments. I'm a huge fan of things like GitHub Codespaces and Gitpod, where you're basically defining what you need to boot up a development environment that's provisioned live to you and manage, which to me is like phenomenally amazing. It's like living the dream that I spent a lot of years working on developer tools, things such as Eclipse a long time ago, but being able to have a development environment that's like already pre-built, loaded with something that you could share as a reusable artifact across other teams and other developers is just it's awesome. But the whole trend here is a lot of the stuff is just shifting closer to where a developer does their normal programming and so on. These artifacts are versioned and live generally in like a source control system like Git, and it's all kind of managed in a typical developer workflow.
So we had the versioning architectures, which have really had a huge influence, right? And now in the code, what you're saying before is like, for instance, in security realm, what we're seeing is like this, just like whereas before you might have to call a third-party service,
Yep.
you don't have to do that anymore. Or increasingly you don't.
I mean, you're still going to have some kind of third-party services at the end of the day, like going to run, things, but a lot of the configuration and kind of setup will be versioned, in your source, control repository, whether it's like your build, right? There's no more messing around in, a Jenkins, configuration to kind of do your build. All that's managed, in your local, could be GitHub Actions file, it could be a Travis file, all this kind of managed there. Your policy security stuff's all going to be kind of configured and managed in a similar way, where you could have a third-party service that actually kind of runs and does the checking, but the config is all going to be closer to where a developer works. There's no reason to jump into another tool to do that configuration anymore.
So when you're looking at some of the young projects out there, what is that point? What does that tell you about what we are seeing emerge? What do you see emerging? What do you see coming that's helping us kind of understand what is hot?
And part of it is like, I think there's multiple approaches to run, like the way I look at it is every time you have projects that kind of compete or overlap, that's generally a sign that, this is something interesting to maybe a broader set of folks. We generally have a lot of competition in CNCF. Like we have multiple service meshes, right? Linkerd, Kuma, like Envoy with, there's tons of these things out here. And then to me, that's a good sign where, the technology is evolving. There's competition, there's interest. We're starting to see this in other areas such as like, WebAssembly. There's multiple projects in CNCF now. There's WASM Cloud, WASM Edge, a couple others that slip my mind, but these are all like different kind of approaches on how to solve the problem, which I think is healthy, right? It just allows us to ensure what best ideas may win out at the end of the day. Sometimes you may have multiple options. We don't generally, it's very rare where there's just one technology that truly wins out. Like I think the like Linux and Kubernetes case is significantly rarer than most technology. You have tons of different choices and options of things, whether it's storage systems, networking things. I think that's just the more natural state of things. And we're seeing it in service mesh, we're seeing it in security. In CNCF, we have a variety of different security related projects that all kind of do different things. Sometimes they directly compete, like a thing like Open Policy Agent and Kyverno, like all have different ways on how to do policy in a Kubernetes context. Like, I mean, that's great to me. Like the fact that we kind of support this like neutral, fair competition, support these projects, educate end users about it, and kind of see what works best for folks is great. I think it truly enables the best kind of technology and ideas to kind of win out. Projects tend to copy each other and so on, which is all fantastic. Like to me, this is just a great case versus like just supporting one way of doing things.
I was trying to think through the different ways that we're seeing these new technologies emerge, and it always comes back to open source, right? And
absolutely.
And is it open source that is driving this, or is it the other way around that's driving the interest in open source?
I think people see open source as the quickest way to get the number of users, community that they need to kind of justify what they're doing, if they're actually having product market fit or project market fit with what they're actually developing out there. It's the best way to kind of build software these days. I think that's the natural, and anyone that wants to build something that's going to be used by a lot of people, I think they have to take an open source community forward approach. I just don't think there's a better way to do it. You could build products on top of this stuff, but for like the base layer, you have to go community open source.
So what
first.
culturally is significant to you that might have been different than 3 years ago, for example?
I mean, I'm seeing just a lot of, like the security industry, for example, was very, let's say, not open source forward. I don't know if you ever attended like an RSA conference in your in your life.
I
Maybe
saw,
little
I
not my speed. It's a little bit more kind of boring, but super important work. But like they're not developer first or open source first by any means. And that is
I did meet Splunk though in 2007 at the RSA. That was interesting.
but that's changing fast now, where you're seeing a lot of these companies, a lot of security companies now are like open sourcing things, open sourcing projects. They're acquiring companies that are like developer first or open source. So that industry shift is happening, fast, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
So
The developer first effort, and so that then makes the need to be almost codify open source practices better internally, which we see with OSPOs, which is part of your work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the more that companies actually depend and produce open source software, they need to have some kind of strategic component or organization with their company that helps that open source program offices or one approach. But there's different ways of doing this. We'll see. There's very few industries out there that open source has not touched, and I think the whole security industry is going to go through this kind of revolution in the next couple years, especially with the added focus from the lovely cybersecurity order that recently happened.
Yeah.
But in general, software literally permeates our lives.
Yeah, it does.
It's everywhere, every device, everything that you touch, it's there. It's time to grow up, I think, as an industry, and to care about these things a little more, add a little bit more discipline, and how we develop software, what we use, and how we collaborate to kind of solve these problems. Security is truly something that affects us all. Like, we have to do it together. It can't just be one organization or one company that owns this.
Yeah. Well, that doesn't seem. Well, I could have a long debate about that, but
I mean, just look at KubeCon. Like, we have supply chain security con, cloud native eBPF day, cloud native security day. I think there's something with open policy agent, cloud native policy day. Like, notice like there's a trend. There's a lot of interest in security.
Yeah.
This time around, where 2-3 years ago, maybe we had like a small cloud native security
maybe.
day. Yeah.
So that would, just in conclusion, I would say, just from our conversation here, security is a hot topic.
Yep.
I think the programming language topics are always going to be of interest, but Rust versus Go is a new kind of.
It's not one or the other there.
It's
Like, I
not
think
one or
they're
the
both
other.
going to grow. I think Rust has matured finally enough where people are going to start using it.
But that relates to security too, right? And if you're going to pick a third, what would you say?
I would say the essentially what I call cloud native IDEs, essentially the modernization of how people develop software. Generally you're very used to doing it locally on your machine, setting up your own environment. Maybe you have some Docker, container images, lovely, but like cloud native provision development environments, things like GitHub Codespaces, Gitpod, like this is going to become a normal thing in the next couple of years as the tools mature, because it's a way of having development environment consistency, and also it's potentially more secure. Like, you don't need to actually check everything out locally, get it all tweaked. You can actually provision a development environment live from the cloud. I think a lot of companies are going to go favor that approach because it's more secure. They could lock it down and so on. So I think that's the big change you'll see.
Then you can just feed all those configurations into a neural net, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And make a training model, and and the software builds itself.
Exactly, Copilot style. You get your provisioned, IDs, and you get a little robot, friend to go write most of your stuff that you need to get done throughout the day. It's great.
little cube. Well, listen, Chris, It's been fun talking with you. Really, congratulations on another start of a new event, and keep up the great work.
Thank you for being here basically since the beginning and supporting us, and especially during these kind of crazy times, actually showing up in person and being part of the community. We truly appreciate it, because it's been a hell of an adventure the last couple of years dealing with events in COVID times.
Well, thank you. So we're moving forward here. So joining us is Chris Aniszczyk, CTO of the CNCF and the Linux Foundation. Thanks, Chris.
Cool. Thanks, Alex.